The first line of the book of Genesis, the very first sentence in all of Scripture, was removed before the Bible reached your hands. Not lost, not mistranslated, removed. And that line contained something the early church fathers decided you were never supposed to understand. A frequency, a vibrational key, something the ancient Gnostic scribes called the Primordial Sound. The utterance that existed before God said, "Let there be light." Before creation, before anything. Here's what the version of Genesis you grew up with says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Clean, simple, familiar. But the oldest manuscripts, the ones found buried in the Egyptian desert, sealed in clay jars, hidden for 17 centuries, begin differently. They begin with a sound, a resonance, a frequency that Gnostic teachers said was the one thing the Archons, the false rulers of this material world, could not survive. And in the next 20 minutes on Awakened Minds, I'm going to show you exactly what that line was, why it was removed, who made that decision, and what it means for you, right now, today, that this knowledge has come back into the world. But first, I need to show you something that changes how you read every word of Scripture you've ever heard. Let me tell you where this story really begins. Around 325 AD, the Emperor Constantine convened a gathering of bishops in a city called Nicaea. You may have heard of it, the Council of Nicaea. Most people are taught that this council settled a theological dispute about the nature of Christ. That's true, but it's maybe 10% of what actually happened there. What the textbooks leave out is that Constantine had a political problem. The Roman Empire was fracturing. Dozens of Christian sects were circulating dozens of gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Pistis Sophia, each with a different cosmology, a different understanding of God, creation, and the human soul. Some of those texts didn't describe a universe with one God at the top. They described a hierarchy, a system of powers, the Archons, who had constructed the material world as a kind of prison. And they described the human being as something those powers desperately needed to keep ignorant. That was not a useful theology for an emperor trying to unify an empire under a single authority. So the council didn't just pick which books belonged in the Bible. They eliminated the ones that taught people how to get free. Origen of Alexandria, one of the greatest early Christian scholars, had written extensively about the pre-existence of souls, the nature of the demiurge, and the layers of spiritual reality above the material world. The council condemned his writings as heresy, burned them where they could, and the texts that survived, the ones sealed in those clay jars at Nag Hammadi, Egypt, not discovered until 1945, those texts tell a completely different story about what the first words of Genesis originally contained. If that council had never happened, you would have grown up knowing that the opening of Scripture wasn't a statement about power. It was an instruction about vibration. So what was that first line? Here's what I want you to understand. And this is the part that Awakened Minds was built to talk about. The Gnostic texts don't just mention a removed line. They explain what it meant. In the Pistis Sophia, a text that survived because it was copied by scribes who knew it was being hunted, there is a passage where Jesus explains the nature of the first act of creation. He doesn't say God spoke light into existence. He says God sang it. The original word that appears in the earliest Aramaic manuscripts of Genesis, before the Greek translation, before the Latin Vulgate, before any version you've ever held in your hands, is not simply reshit, meaning beginning. The full opening phrase in some of the oldest Semitic sources reads closer to Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim, but with a prefix syllable that later scribes systematically dropped. That syllable was a tonal marker. a breath instruction, a frequency. Scholars like Elaine Pagels, who spent decades translating the Nag Hammadi Library at Princeton, has written about how the Gnostic understanding of creation was fundamentally acoustic. The world was not made by a command. It was made by a resonance. And here is where it gets specific. That resonance, according to the Pistis Sophia and the Gospel of Truth, was the exact vibrational frequency that the Archons, the beings described as rulers of the lower material realms, could not inhabit. It was, in the language of those texts, or the frequency of pleroma, the fullness, the divine totality that exists above the constructed world. The Archons couldn't remove it from the cosmos, but they could remove it from the text. And that's exactly what happened. I want to give you 4 layers of proof here, because this isn't something you should take on faith. Let's look at the history, the science, the documents, and then the source you'll least expect. Start with the archaeology. In December of 1945, a farmer named Muhammad Ali was digging near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt. His shovel struck a sealed clay jar about a meter tall. Inside were 13 leather-bound papyrus books, over 50 texts, written in Coptic, the language of early Egyptian Christians. This was the Nag Hammadi Library. It had been buried, scholars believe. There's around 367 AD, the exact year when Athanasius of Alexandria sent a letter to Egyptian monasteries ordering the destruction of all non-canonical texts. Someone hid those books rather than burn them. And what those books contain is a systematic, detailed account of a cosmology that the canonical Bible had completely erased. The Gnostic creation story doesn't begin with a word. It begins with a silence, and then a sound that emerges from that silence and structures all reality. The Gospel of John, the one that made it into the canonical Bible, preserves a trace of this. In the beginning was the Word, logos, sound, vibration. But even that surviving fragment was reframed, turned from a description of acoustic cosmology into a theological statement about Christ. The original wasn't metaphor. It was a description of physics. Well, now here's where modern science enters this story. In 2003, a team of researchers at Cambridge, working with data from the Chandra X-ray Observatory, detected actual sound waves emanating from a black hole at the center of the Perseus galaxy cluster. These were pressure waves, propagating through gas, at a frequency approximately 57 octaves below the lowest note audible to the human ear. The universe makes sound. The universe is sound, at scales we're only beginning to measure. The HeartMath Institute in California has published studies over the past 30 years showing that the human heart generates an electromagnetic field detectable up to several feet outside the body. That field responds to emotional states, and it pulses at frequencies that either synchronize or desynchronize with the fields of other people nearby. What we are literally broadcasting frequency constantly. And then there's the document most people have never heard of, the CIA Gateway Process Report. In 1983, the United States Army commissioned a classified analysis of a consciousness exploration program called the Monroe Institute's Gateway Experience. The document, formally titled Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process, was declassified in 2003 and sat essentially unnoticed until it went viral in 2021. Page after page, it describes human consciousness as fundamentally a frequency phenomenon. The report cites holographic theory, quantum physics, and resonance patterns to argue that altered states of consciousness, the kind ancient mystics cultivated deliberately, allow access to what the document calls the energy continuum underlying physical reality. Or the Army wasn't studying mysticism. They were studying what happens when a human being tunes to a different frequency. Now think about what the Gnostics were describing. The removed first line of Genesis, the tonal marker, the breath instruction, the vibrational key. They said it was the frequency of pleroma, the fullness, the state of consciousness in which the Archons have no authority. The oldest spiritual texts on Earth and a classified U.S. Army report are describing the same thing. Parachurch historian Bart Ehrman, who is not a mystic and not a Gnostic, has written extensively about how the early church canonization process was not a neutral, spirit-led consensus. It was a power negotiation. The texts that survived were the ones that supported centralized episcopal authority. The texts that were destroyed were the ones that said every human being has direct access to the divine. No intermediary required. That's not a coincidence. That's a strategy. Let me tell you who benefits from a population that doesn't know about frequency. The institutional church in the 4th century had a problem. The Gnostic Christians weren't submitting to hierarchical authority because their texts told them they didn't need to. If every person carries the divine spark, the pneuma, and if that spark can be activated by knowing the right frequencies, the right practices, the right cosmological map, then you don't need a bishop. You don't need confession. You don't need an institution standing between you and God. That's an enormous amount of power to leave sitting in the hands of ordinary people. So the institutional church, with the full backing of the Roman imperial apparatus, with soldiers and scribes and the machinery of state authority, made sure those texts disappeared. They didn't just remove the first line of Genesis. They removed the entire framework that would have made that line comprehensible. They stripped out the Archons, the pleroma, the demiurge, the acoustic cosmology. They replaced a map of spiritual liberation with a system of debt, original sin, priestly absolution, institutional mediation. Every time you've felt that nagging sense that something important is missing from what you were taught, that some piece of the puzzle was withheld, you were right. The industry built around that absence is worth considering. The global institutional church operates on revenues estimated in the hundreds of billions annually. That economy depends entirely on you not having direct access. It depends on intermediaries. It depends on you believing that the frequency within you is not enough, that you need someone else to connect you to the divine. I'm not saying the people in those institutions are evil. Most of them don't know what was removed. They were trained on the incomplete version too. But the people who made the decision in 325 AD knew exactly what they were doing. And now, for the first time in 17 centuries, the texts they buried are back in the world, translated, published, available to anyone willing to read them. You're watching this video on a device they couldn't have imagined, and the knowledge they tried to bury is reaching you anyway. So what do you do with this? Here's what I want you to walk away with. 3 things you can actually apply. The first is what I call source reading. Go directly to the primary texts, not books about the Gnostics, the Gnostic texts themselves. The Nag Hammadi Library is available in English translation. The Pistis Sophia is available online for free. The Gospel of Thomas is 46 pages. You can read it this week. When you encounter a line that seems strange or incomplete, a passage that raises more questions than it answers, that strangeness is a signal. That's where something was removed or reframed. Follow the strangeness. The second is what the ancients called toning, and what the CIA Gateway report would call frequency entrainment. Then before you read anything spiritually significant, spend 3 to 5 minutes producing a sustained vocal tone. A simple hum. Not a mantra you've memorized, just a resonance you generate from your own body. The HeartMath research suggests this kind of self-generated frequency synchronizes the electromagnetic field of the heart with the field of the brain. The Gnostic texts suggest something similar in different language. You don't need equipment. You don't need training. You need your own voice and a few minutes of quiet. The third is harder. I call it authority auditing. Every time a religious or institutional source tells you that a text is heretical, fringe, or dangerous, ask who decided that. Ask when. Ask what they had to gain. The books labeled dangerous by the Council of Nicaea are the books that are now sitting in the Nag Hammadi collection. The ideas condemned by institutional authority in 325 AD are the ideas that match what modern physics is discovering about the acoustic nature of reality. When something is called dangerous, it's often because it's free, and things that make people free are expensive to the institutions that profit from captivity. Here's what to watch for as you do this work. In the first few weeks, you'll probably feel something between confusion and exhilaration. The disorientation of realizing that the map you were given doesn't match the territory. That's normal. Don't rush through it. In the months that follow, you'll start noticing that the incomplete map created specific blind spots, places where you deferred to authority because you thought you lacked direct access. You didn't lack access. You lacked information. And now you have it. Let me bring this home. You came into this video having heard, probably hundreds of times, that the Bible begins with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." What you know now is that there are texts, discovered by a farmer with a shovel, sealed in clay jars, hidden from destruction for 17 centuries, that tell a different story. A story where creation begins with a sound, a frequency, a vibrational key that the rulers of the material world needed you to forget. You've seen the archaeology. The Nag Hammadi Library, buried the same year Athanasius ordered the burning. You've seen the science. Cambridge researchers detecting sound waves from a black hole. The HeartMath Institute documenting the electromagnetic field of the heart. A declassified Army report describing consciousness as a frequency phenomenon. You've seen the motive, an empire that needed compliance more than it needed enlightened individuals. And you now have 3 things you can do today. Read the primary sources, work with your own resonance, and audit every claim of authority that tries to tell you the direct path is closed. In 20 minutes, you've recovered something that was kept from most people for 1,700 years. That's not a small thing. There is so much more in those Nag Hammadi texts that we haven't touched. The nature of the Archons, the geography of the Pleroma, what the Gospel of Philip says about the bridal chamber, and the resurrection of consciousness. If you want to go deeper, leave the word frequency in the comments. That tells me this is the direction you want to go, and I'll build the next video around exactly that. If this reached something real in you today, share it with someone who's been asking the same questions. The algorithm buries this kind of content. You sharing it is the only way it gets out. And subscribe to Awakened Minds if you haven't. This is what we do here. The first line of Genesis was a frequency. They removed the line. They couldn't remove the frequency. It's still in you. We'll see you in the next one.